All right, so let's now visit about how all of that is used in determining the value of an animal, and we're going to add to that a few other factors. So what I'm showing you now is a grid. This is a grid, and if you notice, it has a quality grading. It has, first of all, a base carcass price. That's the price that we then add or subtract premiums and discounts from based off of the individual qualities of that animal. The base carcass on this grid, if you look at the green bars or the green colored rows, you'll see that the base carcass price, and then you'll see that would be a choice yield grade 3 animal that weighs between 600 and 1,000 pounds. So that would be the base carcass price. As you take a look at that base carcass price, if that animal ended up being better than that, let's say it's a choice yield grade 2 a carcass that weighs between 600 and 1,000 pounds. And that's the carcass weight, not the live weight. So the carcass weight would be 600 to 1,000 pounds. Then you would actually, on this particular grid, add, because it's a yield grade 2, then on this particular grid, because it's a yield grade 2, you would add $2 to that base price. So you notice the base price for a choice yield grade 3 animal that weighs between 600 and 1,000 pounds is $203 per 100 pounds of carcass. It's really important. Now this is on a carcass weight basis. If instead it was a choice yield grade 2 that weighed between 600 and 1,000 pounds, then that carcass would receive $205 per 100 pounds of carcass weight. So remember, we have two ways of selling cattle. One is on a live cash basis, which is a per 100 weight live basis for the entire pen of cattle. When we sell them on a grid, it's on a per 100 weight basis of a carcass, okay, for each individual animal that comes through and is graded from that pen. And then they put that together to come up with the total value for that pen. So each animal is valued on a carcass grid basis, where on a live cash basis, it is actually the average price for all animals in that particular pen. So if there's 40 animals in a pen, then all 40 animals would receive the same price per 100 weight live, where on a grid, each individual carcass would receive a price on a carcass weight basis for its individual quality grade, yield grade, and if there's any other potential discounts or premiums that would be added to that. So, for example, as we look at this grid, let's say it's the best of all worlds. It's a prime yield grade 1 carcass that weighs between 600 and 1,000 pounds. Then that carcass, instead of receiving the base price of $202, it would receive $14 more for being prime. So now we're up to $216. And then it would receive a $4 addition for being yield grade 1. So now we're up to $220 that you would receive for that particular animal on a per 100 carcass weight basis. There's not many of those animals around, so if you did have them, that would be a big, big premium that you would receive. The most common discount that is received in our industry are those cattle that grade select. So what would happen if we, instead of having a choice yield grade 3 carcass that weighed between 600 and 1,000, instead we had a select yield grade 3 carcass that weighed between 600 and 1,000. Well, we're going to take off, in this particular grid, $12 for grading USDA select instead of the base grade of choice. So that carcass would receive, instead of $202, would receive $190 per 100 pounds of carcass weight. So you can see how a grid is more on an individual basis, animal basis, on a carcass weight basis, than it is the total pen or aggregate of the pen. Now there are some other items that you'll see on there. One is certified Angus beef, which we'll talk about more in depth in just a minute. Another one is some other discounts, fairly large discounts. Hard bone, over 30 months, dark cutting, and dairy also receives a discount, and then very light and very heavy cattle. Dark cutting is a phenomenon that happens when cattle undergo long-term stress. Generally it's 9 hours to 12 hours long, and that animal, because of that stress, it has some biological changes that occur to the muscle. There's no food safety issues here. It's just a natural change because of that stress. Now, the most common stress are weather changes. So as you go from warm temperature days to very cold nights, that animal isn't used to that temperature drop, and therefore it starts to shiver, and that creates some different changes, some changes in the biochemistry of the muscle where the pH actually stays higher in that muscle than the normal muscle. The normal pH of meat after harvest is generally about 5.6. In animals that are dark cutting, they generally have a pH closer to what they would have if they were a living animal, a pH in the 6s. And because of that pH change, the water in the muscle is held on to more tightly. Just because of that higher pH, it's held on to more tightly, and actually the light is more absorbed by that muscle and less light is reflected, and that is what gives that ribeye a darker appearance, and that's why we call it dark cutting. It's not because it's an animal from an old animal, it's because that animal underwent long-term stress that created biological changes in the muscle. So when we cut into it and we rib it, it's dark. So they call that carcass a dark cutter. There's nothing wrong with the meat from a food safety standpoint. The problem is that consumers don't want to buy dark colored meat. They like bright cherry red colored meat. And that is the ideal color of beef, is bright cherry red color. Also, there's a term called no roll. No roll in today's term is generally those carcasses that would either be C maturity carcasses or carcasses that are USDA standard. Instead of calling them those names, they would end up just putting them in a box that was a box of beef that was really kind of unnamed. They might give it a fancy name like Dan's Special Meat, and not call it USDA Choice Meat. So rather than putting the name on it, they would just call it some fancy name and put that on the box. And they call that beef that's sold like that, they call it no roll. Originally that meant ungraded beef, but today that doesn't really fit. So generally no roll are beef from carcasses that were either standard or generally those C maturity animals, a few of those that might end up being harvested with the fed beef. USDA standard, again, that's a no roll. Then extremely light and heavy cattle, because they also have extremely small and large cuts. Packers do not want cattle that are extremely heavy or extremely light. They like that 600 to 1,000 range. And so to have more consistent cuts, when they get heavier or larger than that, they get really big or small cuts respectively. And packers and then furthermore food service and retailers do not like those very large and very small cuts, so therefore they have a discount as well. The last two defects that we'll visit about today, we call them defects because they're actually receive fairly significant discounts on the carcass grid, and that is those cattle that are either over 30 months of age or hard bone. So we'll explain hard bone in a minute. Over 30 months are animals that they're deemed by dentition, the use of teeth, to be over 30 months of age. And USDA has designed a whole different set of regulations on how to handle those cattle because of BSE. Now, BSE stands for bovine spongiform encephalopathy, another term for that we commonly call mad cow disease. It's extremely rare in the United States, but both the industry and the government have put in place what we call firewalls in case there ever was a case in the United States to make sure that the infective tissue never gets into the human food chain. And so because of that, the carcasses that are over 30 months have to be handled differently. They not only take the spinal cord out like they do in the young animals, but they take the entire spinal column out to make sure that no nervous tissue from those animals ever get into the human food chain, which is where the infected agent would be if it ever was in the United States. And so there are many other firewalls, but all those have been put in place to make sure that the beef is free of this mad cow disease, even if there happen to be 1 or 2 cases that might be in the United States. And it's, again, very, very rarely found in the U.S. It's only been found 3 times. So the way that they determine whether they're over 30 months is through dentition. And what you'll see here's a picture of an animal that has all of its temporary teeth. And at about 18 months, okay, they start dropping their baby teeth. And just like in humans, they'll drop routinely the first set of permanent incisors that would come out would be the ones in the very front. That's a pair that would come out. That happens at about 18 months of age. Then the second pair start to come out and the permanent teeth replace them at about 24 months of age. And so if one of those second pairs have even broken the gum line, then the USDA considers that animal over 30 months of age, even though that process happens at about 24 months. They do that again just to make sure there's an added insurance safety margin, making sure that they keep infected tissue from BSE out if there ever happened to be a case in the United States. All right, the other one is called hard bone. Hard bone is a slang term that we use for those cattle that are in advanced maturity. And remember, the way that we determine maturity and whether they're old, like C maturity cattle, the way we determine that is looking at the buttons on the end of the spine. So if those animals are C or D maturity, then remember that soft white cartilage turns to hard flinty bone. And so we call those cattle that have that kind of bone in the buttons hard bone cattle. That's a simple term for animals that are older chronologically in age when they actually come to the facility to be harvested.